Hello, people. So, Friday before Labor Day weekend, how better to spend it than on a live stream about a political controversy? I'm sure you are absolutely thrilled with having this opportunity to spend your holiday, or at least the lead up to your holiday, talking about political corruption and the the ways in which the electoral process can be subverted, not just by the vested interest in a party structure, but by the people on the outside who are influence peddlers, and whose expressions of support or disapproval are taken much more seriously than they should be by the people who are actually involved in conducting the process. So, kind of just killing a little bit of time here while some people cycle into the chat. I didn't announce this ahead of time. Another one of my little bit spur of the moment streams that was brought on by my, mild involvement in what I'm about to talk about. And I like to keep people on their toes, so you never know when a stream might come about. It's something I like to keep you in suspense for. Okay, so Susan Sarandon is somebody who attracts an incredible amount of vitriol online in particular. And that stems not just from the 2016 campaign, although that's probably when it reached a crescendo. Susan Sarandon has been involved in political activism for a very long time, and you can go and find articles that denounce her from the 2000 election when she was a Ralph Nader supporter and was one of the high-profile, celebrities and people with some stature to back Ralph Nader, who was then running on the Green Party ticket. And as you probably know, if you have even minimal familiarity with that election, Ralph Nader ended up getting blamed for George W. Bush winning overall. Lost in the popular vote, but won the Electoral College, and came down to the whole recount debacle in Florida. And the hostility toward Nader on the part of Democratic officials ended up getting also foisted onto people like Sarandon, who had been Nader's advocates. So this didn't just come out of nowhere where she became persona non grata among Democratic consultant and operative types in 2016. Although, fast forward to 2016, and she did get a ton of negative attention because she was one of the people who was supporting Bernie and became known as a Bernie or Buster, meaning she was supporting Bernie and was not going to accept any alternative in that cycle, at least if the alternative was Hillary Clinton, who she was pretty clear that she was not going to support under any circumstances. And she actually, during the 2016 cycle, would go out and make comments that caused a lot of controversy, having to do with her speculation that if Trump were to be elected over Hillary, it could conceivably result in the radicalization of parts of the electorate and have some second-order positive consequences in her eyes. This came to be known as sort of the accelerationist argument for Trump, where if Trump was elected, it would accelerate the process, again, toward radicalization that would create conditions where Bernie or somebody of Bernie's ilk would be more likely to win election. And, I think in part, some of what Sarandon forecasted there has been borne out to some extent. I mean, the Democratic Party electorate has been, radicalized, but there has been a very distinct policy shift in the overall attitudes of the party, whether that has to do with Medicare for all, which not long ago was termed single-payer healthcare, and now the more common descriptor is Medicare for all, and it seems to be gaining support. You have a lot of activist organizations which have gotten a lot of new energy as a result of Trump's election. Now, you can kind of debate whether that activist energy is always funneled in a constructive direction. I think it's a mixed bag there. But just on a sort of a more abstract level, I think Sarandon's point wasn't entirely far-fetched. I mean, I think she was onto something there. And yet it caused a huge amount of pushback towards her individually because she was seen as making this kind of secondhand argument that it wouldn't be the worst of all possible outcomes necessarily if Trump got elected. And Sarandon also, was right in the sense that the DNC did institute some reforms that diminished the power of superdelegates since 2016. Now, are there still potential issues around which the DNC might be accused of rigging? Yeah. But their potential to rig did decrease over the course of the years that spanned between 2016 and now. So the anger at Sarandon, I always thought was extraordinarily misplaced. And on top of that, she at least has conviction. She has certain principles in a political sense that she sticks by, and she doesn't budge on them. And that's an indication that somebody actually has real committed beliefs in something, which is a rarity. And, so if you are super mad at Sarandon for sticking to those commitments, then that maybe says more about you than it does her. And Sarandon, you don't have to agree with her on everything to think of her as somebody who actually does have a set of principles that she abides by, even in the face of very, let's say, challenging political circumstances. So yesterday, Susan put out a tweet that caused a lot of people to freak out, namely the same old types of Democratic consultants and activists and, their boosters in the media who, claim to be objective, but always end up supporting the institutional interests of the Democratic Party. Sarandon put out a tweet that actually quoted me. So she highlighted one of my tweets, which, thanks, I guess. And in which she said the following. Just pull it up here really quickly. She said, Tulsi Gabbard deserves to be on that debate stage. We need her voice. Now, that seems a little bit innocuous. She did link to my tweet in her tweet, which, of course, makes people very angry because they tend to hate me for a variety of reasons. So if Susan Sarandon is doing anything that's seen as promoting me, that's seen as a very immoral offense on her part. But just the text of what she said, that she deserves to be on the debate stage and we need her voice, it's fairly innocuous. I mean, it's not as if she's explicitly alleging rigging. It's not as if she's saying anything overtly conspiratorial. She's simply saying that Tulsi has demonstrated that she has a unique position in the race, and therefore everybody stands to benefit if she's on the debate stage. But of course, the reaction was swift and denunciatory, and Susan was denounced as, perpetuating this idea that the process is rigged and whatever. The people who dismiss anybody who alleges rigging as conspiracy theorists seem to forget that Donna Brazile, the interim chair of the DNC in 2016, herself said that the process was rigged the last cycle. Elizabeth Warren said that the process was rigged, and Bernie Sanders has even suggested that the process was rigged against him. So the idea that it's out of this world bonkers for anybody to exhibit similar cynicism today just ignores recent history, when people who are now seen as totally mainstream, or at least viewed as reliable in some sense, when they said the same thing not long ago. I mean, are your memories that short? I would think not. And, on top of that, Sarandon didn't even allege rigging. She just said that Tulsi deserves to be on the stage. And Sarandon's concept of desert could be on the substance, in that she thinks that Tulsi is saying things of value that ought to be aired on that kind of stage, probably around foreign policy, or she could be making a more procedural argument where Tulsi is being excluded on grounds that don't hold up to scrutiny. Either way, it was an innocuous comment, but the knives came out very quickly for Susan Sarandon, as tends to happen with her. Even though, for the most part, she seems like a fairly rational and understated person. It's just that she's not willing to go along with conventional orthodoxies. And that makes a lot of people very upset. But, in terms of Sarandon and Tulsi, this isn't the first time that she's done or said something that it would indicate support. She contributed financially to Tulsi earlier this year, and that ended up getting twisted into a hit piece of the Daily Beast, where they, culled through Tulsi's campaign contributors and tried to make a narrative about how she was somehow backed by Russia, of course, or if not backed by Russia, backed by people trying to sow dissension in the party, such as Sarandon, which, in their warped mind, advances the interests of Russia. And so, Sarandon was already basically on the public record as having supported Tulsi, at least financially. And on top of that, they appeared together on a panel at the Sanders Institute gathering that happened in December of last year in Burlington, Vermont. Tulsi and Susan Sarandon were side by side on a panel together where they talked about all manner of issues. So it's no secret that Sarandon would at least have some kind of affinity for Tulsi, and yet people were, shocked that Sarandon could have made this kind of relatively supportive comment. And, so a lot of that blowback ends up coming my way because she thinks people are telling her it's very disreputable and shameful for her to have said, to have promulgated anything that I might have said, because that's, very, very bad in the eyes of these people. But all I said was something that is very, I think, undisputable. And I'll repeat it here. But I said in the tweet that she circulated, reminder, if the DNC simply accepted polls conducted by the two largest newspapers in two early critical primary states, New Hampshire and South Carolina, Tulsi would have qualified for the next debate. Their rules, meaning the DNC's, make no sense. And that's why people are rightly cynical about this absurd exclusion. So if anybody can contest anything that I said there on the merits, please go right ahead, because you're not going to be able to do it. It's all outside the bounds of reasonable dispute. It's just true. And I went on to say in the thread that was linked to, I'll keep repeating it for the edification of media scolds. There have been 0 approved polls from New Hampshire, South Carolina, or Nevada in the past 5 weeks. And what I didn't mention was that there's only been 1 approved poll from Iowa in that same time period. Right? And to base the entire debate criteria process on national polls, essentially, runs contrary to how these campaigns are actually run in terms of the primary process. 4 states vote first. So the candidates go and campaign in those states. Those are the states in which candidates are actually campaigning. So you'd think that they would have extra significance in terms of the debate criteria. But in practice, they have not, because there has been a dearth of polling taken in those states over the summer. So you're kind of privileging, but by instituting the rules that they have, they are neglecting that the candidates are spending the bulk of their time in a particular handful of states, and that's where voters are most becoming aware of them and being able to vet them. So the process doesn't make sense from that standpoint. I went on the thread that the party-directed winnowing process is nonsensical. There's no national primary. It's not as if everybody votes on the same day. In the primary process, it's a kind of it's a state-by-state complex series of contests that isn't akin to a presidential debate, where a presidential election in a general election where the national figures are more relevant. I went on to say you can scream about the rules, quote unquote, but the rationale for these rules has never been explicated by the party bosses who devise them in secret. The people who devise these rules have never clarified why it is that certain polls are deemed approved and others not, even polls that are conducted by reputable organizations. And as I've mentioned ad nauseum on this channel, the Boston Globe and the Post and Courier, in New Hampshire and South Carolina, respectively, which are the largest newspapers in those two states. If you can come up with a logical, sound explanation for why those polls should be excluded, like on what basis is that a remotely reasonable rule, then okay, fine. But nobody really who is, coming at me or Susan Sarandon can explain why that makes a lick of sense, which it doesn't. The candidates are actually campaigning in New Hampshire and South Carolina. Therefore, you'd expect the results of polls in those states to actually be given a little bit of primacy in the debate qualification process, but in practice they have not. And that gets to, the issues with why polls are conducted and why they're not. They cost a lot of money. They're sponsored by media organizations generally, and to not have a single qualifying poll from the 4 early primary states, except for one in Iowa, in the past 5 weeks. Again, it's just inconsistent with how the candidates are actually running their campaigns. They're following the rules in a sense, but the rules that have been imposed by the DNC are inconsistent with their actual campaigning. So they're right to complain about it. And it's not just Tulsi who has done so. It's Steve Bullock, Michael Bennett, Marianne Williamson, and others. And they all have legitimate arguments to some degree, but Tulsi's is the strongest because she's most closely on the threshold of having been excluded on spurious grounds. One other thing that I note in this thread that was, circulated by Sarandon is that Bernie in 2015, 2016 gained traction in large part because he surged very early on in New Hampshire. At this point in the 2015 cycle, Bernie was already ahead of Hillary Clinton in New Hampshire. At the same time, he was trailing enormously in the national polls, right? But because he was able to parlay his New Hampshire support into a gradual process of gaining ground on Hillary across the country. And that's because he was campaigning in New Hampshire. Those were the voters who were actually hearing from him, right? Whereas if you live, for better or worse, in California or Texas or wherever, you're not having person-to-person contact with these candidates for the most part. Now, could you argue that's a flaw in the system overall? Maybe. I actually do think that there's some utility in having some of the smaller states first, because otherwise it would just be it would purely come down to who has the most national media exposure and who has the most money because of the insane cost of campaigning in California, for example. So the rules in a sense just don't make sense. And unless you can defend the rules on the substance rather than just proclaiming that the rules existed, which they do, even though they haven't been actually rationalized by anybody who devised them in the DNC power structure, then really just shut up about the rules. I mean, you sound like a school marm who is sending somebody to detention because they violated the rules, even if the rules don't make sense. And it's not as if that these rules are like enshrined in the Constitution or anything. They're not like the Electoral College. They're rules that are made up on the fly by the party bosses who are operating in secret and without transparency. That's the big problem that has been cited as to these rules. Nobody can explain why the Boston Globe and the Post and Courier do not count toward the debate qualifying criteria. That's not a constitutional mandate. It's something that was just arbitrarily come up with by Tom Perez and his associates. And so, that's the thread that Susan Sarandon linked to. I don't see anybody really, again, contesting it on the merits. If you've seen that, let me know, and I'll address their criticisms. But their criticisms just don't hold up to scrutiny. That's the bottom line. And the people who are objecting because they don't want to give the impression that the process has been less than fair, even though there is no principle of fairness by which I think you can justify Tulsi's exclusion. And Susan Sarandon obviously recognizes that. And good for her, and good for her for not bucking or capitulating to the hordes of online naysayers who constantly go after her because she happens to be one of the few people in national political life, even though that she's an actor, who are willing to stick by their guns and don't bend to popular outrage and actually have some principles that they're operating on. There are too few people who do that, and good for Susan Sarandon for being one of the very few. Now, there was another interesting development that happened over the past few days, past 24 hours, actually, where out of nowhere, Congressman Ro Khanna replied to a tweet that was, hold on, let me just pull it up here, because I have, it's when you have like a reasonably large following as I do, it's pretty convenient because people constantly send you stuff that you might have missed. And somebody sent me this tweet from Ro Khanna, and it's a little bit odd because Ro Khanna sent it yesterday in reply to a tweet that was sent on August 12th by this guy, Peter Friedrich, who has been one of Tulsi's chief antagonists in the media and wrote an article for an Indian magazine called The Caravan that alleges that Tulsi is basically being propped up by a fascist paramilitary in India called the RSS. Now, I read this article because somebody had sent it to me previously. It's actually behind a paywall, so I had to find like a free version of it because, I try to support journalism, but I'm not going to pay for an Indian newspaper for a subscription just to read one article. Sorry. And, it's very long, and it goes largely just into the history of the RSS and how they, essentially try to cultivate influence in the United States through various affiliates. And there's not a whole lot about Tulsi in particular. I mean, he kind of weaves it in here and there, but mostly has nothing to do with Tulsi. And a lot of the connections that he asserts between Tulsi and the RSS are really just innuendo. This Intercept piece from January keeps getting cited about how she's being boosted by contributors of who are Hindu nationalists. And I basically, not to toot my own horn, but I single-handedly forced the Intercept to essentially retract that piece because they did this insane thing where they basically just went through the contributors and cast aspersion on them because if they had Hindu-sounding names, as if you can infer from someone's name that they have a affiliation with like right-wing Hindu nationalism, which was insane. So that piece is not credible, and it keeps getting cited. Peter Friedrich, I guess he's a journalist, but he also identifies as an activist, which is fine. But he showed up at Tulsi's events and like basically caused an uproar. I don't think that's necessarily inconsistent with doing reasonable journalism, but I didn't find much in that article that implicated Tulsi directly. It was, again, just a lot of innuendo and dot connecting. And it didn't hold up to scrutiny, and I did have to subject myself and actually read it. So it was odd that Ro Khanna, out of nowhere, seemingly boosts this piece yesterday, 17 days after Friedrich had tweeted about it. What prompted Ro Khanna to do that? I don't know. It seems like it might have been a slight underhanded attack on Tulsi, which is also ironic because Ro Khanna has been supported by the Hindu American Foundation as well. And that's what people point to suggest that Tulsi has these nefarious ties with Hindu nationalists. The Hindu American Foundation basically just supports any Hindu running for office, as many, identity or religious based interest groups do. And you can criticize that, I guess, but Ro Khanna, has benefited from that just as much as Tulsi. It's just that Tulsi was the first Hindu elected to Congress, so of course she's going to generate support from people who maybe don't agree with her on every issue, and maybe or even conservative in some senses, but nonetheless support her on the grounds that she's the first. She was a historic trailblazer in that sense. But it's odd for Ro Khanna to be kind of touting that line when he's gotten support from the very same people. And is also a Hindu, obviously, but was elected 4 years after Tulsi, and so doesn't get the same kind of suspicion as she does. Obviously, he's not running for president, but he's one of the national co-chairs of the Bernie Sanders campaign. So people, I think, reasonably took that as a kind of attack by proxy on Tulsi from the Bernie campaign. I don't think that it was. I don't know, Efren, but I every now and then you hear things that are a little bit questionable about Ro Khanna. I support some things that he does, and I think that his voice is valuable in certain respects. But there are some things that do raise a few red flags. But it was interesting because Nina Turner, another co-chair. I mean, this is kind of like this weird drama, but Nina Turner is another co-chair of the Bernie campaign, and she got involved and defended Tulsi. Shortly after this sort of inexplicable tweet from Ro Khanna, and so maybe she's trying to calm things down there. I don't know what really went on in terms of the precise timeline, but it is interesting that Nina Turner would feel like she's in a position where she has to come out and publicly defend Tulsi now that she's campaigned with Tulsi in the past. Nina Turner was the former head of Our Revolution, the kind of para-political group that Bernie formed after the 2016 election. And Nina Turner dealt with Tulsi in that capacity. You can go and find pictures of them campaigning together in Hawaii, and they've always been very complimentary of each other. So it seems like Nina Turner's kind of subtweeted Ro Khanna there, because today, first she did a tweet where she discouraged like any kind of infight between Bernie and Tulsi's supporters, which was prompted, in fact, by Ro Khanna. I mean, that's the reason why there was any of that minimal online fighting in the first place. And she also came out and said that Nina Turner said that she's sending aloha and light to my sister Tulsi Gabbard. And the timing of that seems a little notable, because it was shortly after another co-chair of the Bernie campaign decided to basically attack Tulsi, which was a little bit unexpected. And the source of that attack is a little dubious. So I'm not sure what's going on there with Ro. So people are, I think understandably a little incensed about that. And it kind of gets to the question of how, if Tulsi still has a chance of getting into the October debate, and she's campaigning pretty hard in Iowa and New Hampshire over the next week, and so don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but like, let's say she doesn't make the October debate, how will then she be incorporated into the Bernie campaign structure? Is there a willingness for her to be incorporated? I mean, she was somebody who was very much associated with the Bernie campaign early on. She, as I've mentioned many times, she was chosen to put his name into nomination at the 2016 convention, which is basically the most high-profile surrogate role that a campaign can have at a convention, or that a campaign can allocate at a convention. She participated, like I mentioned, in the Sanders Institute gathering last December. But there are now a lot of people there's like a section of the Bernie support base, I wouldn't say a majority, but a loud vocal minority maybe, who dislike her for reasons that I think are usually not valid. So is there going to be a willingness for the Bernie campaign structure to incorporate her back into it? Does she personally want to do that? We don't know. I think that I think she has a decent chance of staying in the race for a long time. Even if she's seen as not as in contention, because she's spreading a message. And, it does kind of hinge, sadly, on whether she gets into the debate in October, which could revitalize things to a pretty significant degree. So, yep, that's a little bit of a rundown of what's been going on. If you're immersed in this stuff on Labor Day weekend, as I am, I feel bad for you, because it's almost not worth it. Go have a barbecue or something. But that's just my station in life, I guess. All right, people. If you have any last second super chats, I'll respond to them. Somebody says, as a radicalized libertarian, shows like Michael Kyle and Jimmy Dore opened me up to a new way of thinking. Tulsi is the first candidate I've ever donated to, and will support her to the end. Well, that's if I had a positive influence on you, or you see me as having a positive influence, then I respect it. I'm not a libertarian. I've never have been. I've written for libertarian publications, and I know a lot of libertarians, but I'm not I don't. I don't support a lot of, especially right libertarian ideas in practice, where their political agenda ends up resulting in the curtailment of the social welfare state. I don't think that your ideological beliefs about the innate violence of the state should result in people having their their Medicaid coverage taken away. That seems like a very shallow libertarianism in my estimation, and I've always believed that. That said, I was one of the few people in the media who would point to some of the positives of, for example, the Ron Paul candidacy, especially in 2012. I wasn't a journalist in 2008 when he first ran for president as a Republican, but I was in 2012, and I tried to highlight how Ron Paul was generating some kind of cross-ideological support among people who aren't necessarily fervent libertarians, but supported especially his foreign policy views, maybe his views on drug prohibition and civil liberties, his support for Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange. And you see some similar dynamics now in terms of the support base that Tulsi has. It doesn't lend itself to easy categorization in a way that you can, I think, trace back to some extent to the Ron Paul campaigns. This tends to happen when a campaign is focused largely on foreign policy. You have strange bedfellows, quote unquote, who kind of congregate and support that candidate for a variety of reasons, especially if they feel just on a basic sense they're challenging establishment orthodoxies, which Ron Paul and Tulsi Gabbard both do. Tulsi Gabbard is more in line with my ideological sensibilities in that she's calling for more state healthcare services, which I've always supported, even though it's not like a big focus of mine journalistically, and other things of that sort. But just as in terms of her sensibility, there is something that you can kind of delineate back to Ron Paul that I think is interesting and worth further examination. Somebody says, you and Greenwald are my only hope for a healthy DNC, and others like you. Thanks, MAGA. I mean, if you're saying MAGA, I don't know how interested in you really are in a healthy DNC, but who knows what exactly you meant by that. I'm less and less inclined to now believe that there's any legitimate affirmative argument for a Trump reelection, especially if you take seriously the reasons why he generated the support that he did in 2016, where he departed from certain orthodoxies in the Republican Party. Those haven't really come into fruition, in large part because of his personnel that he has installed. Just today or yesterday, he came out and said that okay, the guy clarifies that he's been a former libertarian. Okay, that's good to know. Just today or yesterday, Trump clarified that the withdrawal, the deal that his administration has been negotiating with the Taliban. I think it's good to be actually in negotiations with the Taliban. That's a positive development, and that would have been almost unthinkable in the George W. Bush years because you can't negotiate with terrorists or whatever the talking point was. But Trump said that the withdrawal deal will only result in the withdrawal of about half of the troops currently in the country, and would leave more troops there, around 8,600, than were in the country in 2017 when before Trump did this surge in Afghanistan in the summer. So Trump did do a minor surge, nowhere near the level of the surge that Obama instituted in 2009-10, but still enough of a surge where it increased the number of total troops from the U.S. in the country, somewhat significantly. And the idea that it's a withdrawal to still keep thousands of troops in the country who are obviously going to be engaging in some combat role is foolish. I mean, Obama claimed that he was going to end the combat mission in Afghanistan, but we still have U.S. troops dying in Afghanistan on a semi-regular basis. There was one that was just announced today who died on August 29th. So ask Trump why he's still doing that, given his rhetoric on foreign interventionism, and explain to me why that would justify supporting him for re-election, especially if you did so that on foreign policy grounds. I mean, it's true that Trump hasn't started a new war yet, which is actually somewhat of an anomaly in presidential history, but that's a pretty low bar to clear. Let's see. scrolling up to see more super chats. Warren did admit that the process was rigged, but let us not forget, in typical Warren fashion, she backtracked on the claim just a couple days later. In terms of, maybe she did backtrack somewhat, but she still agreed that the process was rigged at one point, and there's no fudging with that quote. It's on the record and it's there. So Warren did at one point say that the DNC had rigged the 2016 primaries, and that's just not disputable at this point, notwithstanding whatever backtracking she later did. Somebody tells me to check out something that I won't vocalize because I don't know what it is, and I may do that. You never know what kind of trouble you can get into just randomly repeating super chat comments. Don't want to have the boomerang back on me and cause problems. All right, people, thank you for joining in. May occur to me to do this again relatively soon. You never know. Keep you on your toes. All right, have a good day.